When I walked into the shrine this morning, I went over behind the Blessed Sacrament where Carl is, the organist, and I just wanted to say hello. And I was wearing a gray sweatshirt, and embroidered on the gray sweatshirt was the name Cape May. He said to me, I hope you're going to say something about Cape May today, and in point of fact, I am. I've been thinking about Cape May partially because of our poor brothers and sisters in Florida and those along the coast who have been in part suffering from Hurricane Matthew. But one of the reasons why I was thinking about Cape May is, of course, obviously, it's right on the coast, but also the house that we have there sits not too far from the beach. But the interesting thing about the house is that it's one of those kinds of older houses on the coasts that were built in such a way that when you enter the first floor, you are actually one level above the ground. So that, for example, the ground level is actually what we would think of as a basement or a cellar, and there's sort of slats there for the water to flow through in the event that there is a flood, which there often are. But as a result of all of this, when I'm there as the house manager, as we're now referring to it, and I'm in between my little jobs and not doing anything, I sit on that porch. And because it's one level up, people who are walking by the front, they can't see me, and I normally can't see them except out of the corners of my eyes as they either approach from one direction or the other. And as they go by, I very often eavesdrop on what they're saying. The moral of that story is be careful. You never know when somebody is listening. But I was sitting there at one point this summer. It was an early afternoon, and I could see out of the side of my eye that a mother and her little girl were walking by. And as they were walking by, they were apparently heading towards the beach, or what they thought was the beach. And suddenly it dawned on the mother that, in fact, the beach isn't in the direction towards what would be my left, but it's actually perpendicular. It's in the direction of the back of the shrine. She realized this, and her little girl was quite a number of feet in front of her, and she said to the little girl, you know, we got to turn around, we got to go back and go down the street. We're moving in the wrong direction. And as she went by the house again, and I didn't actually see her because she was right out front, I heard her either editorializing to the little girl or to herself. She says, you know, it suddenly dawns on me that I've spent an awful lot of my life walking in the wrong direction. And I thought to myself, I'm going to tuck that thought away because it got me to thinking how sometimes in life we find ourselves heading in the wrong direction. And one of the wrong directions in which we sometimes head is we allow ourselves to become mired in our misery. And when that happens, sometimes we tend to forget the gifts that God gives us and the kinds of perhaps gratefulness that we ought to have. As was mentioned earlier, the subject of our meditation today is really gratefulness. One might call it the virtue of gratefulness, or really the grace of gratefulness, because as the preface for one of the Eucharistic prayers that we'll use today says, even our thanksgiving is itself God's gift. This brings me, of course, to today's gospel. Today's gospel is drawn from the 11th chapter of St. Luke. And to be honest with you, in this gospel, we get a sense that our Lord Jesus is just a little bit frustrated, if not perhaps even angry. Because as he says, this generation, they seek a sign. They're looking for a great sign. And the truth of the matter is how often we do that in our lives. We look for signs. We want big signs. I do this myself. This is not beyond me. Whenever the Powerball goes above $70 million, I buy my ticket. You know, I'm looking for my sign. It's currently, I checked this morning, $107 million. I believe that's $71 million in a cash award. I will buy my ticket before Wednesday. I keep saying to Father people, please pray that I win. You know, I'll give the Miraculous Metal Shrine $1 million. That might seem like a little bit, but the list of gift recipients is getting longer and longer. And I got to get my condo too. But, you know, we look for these huge gifts, and sometimes we miss the ordinary gifts and miracles that life brings to us. Fresh in our memories, of course, should be yesterday's gospel from the 28th Sunday of the year, which is also from St. Luke. It's the 17th chapter, and we all remember it. It is the story of the 10 lepers. And there are two little interesting things that one needs to remember about that story. When these poor lepers cry out to Jesus to heal them, Jesus does not give them anything amazing to do. There is no combination of spittle and mud that he puts on them. He doesn't bring them aside with special disciples. He doesn't even touch them. He simply says to them, go and show yourselves to the priests. And on their way, they're healed. And only one of them comes back to say, thank you. It's rather interesting, as I was meditating on that and was reading about yesterday's gospel, before I preached yesterday at the parish where I helped, I realized one of the exegetes, one of the biblical scholars, mentioned it's the only place in all of the Gospels where anyone ever bothers to thank Jesus for something that he has done. There is often praise of God. People are often amazed at what Jesus does, and they follow him like they would follow a sideshow. They're looking for the great and the marvelous things. They're looking for the big things. But along the way, so often in life as we travel, we have all of these miracles, these gifts that God gives to us that sometimes we don't realize. In a way that I really haven't before, I was listening closely before Mass began to the various thank you, Mary, letters that were being read by Father Callahan. And it struck me that in some cases, these were very big things. But in other cases, they were very small things, at least by some people's standards. Thank you that in the midst, for example, of a broken heart, you sent me someone to love. You sent me love. So often in life, this is the way that it is. It is fundamental to our Christian faith to be thankful. A number of years ago, back at the university, I was teaching a graduate course on the Eucharist. As we all know, the word Eucharist comes from a Greek word, and the word means to give thanks. And it's not simply the heart of our faith as a sacrament. It's also the heart of our faith as a disposition, that as a Christian people, we are a thankful people because we know that we have been saved, not necessarily us alone, but we are the blessed ones who know that we have been saved and who know at what cost we have been saved. That God has so loved us that even in the midst of our sinfulness, God has still reached out to us and touched us and saved us, even as he saved and healed those poor lepers. And yet still at times we seem to want even greater signs as the people in today's gospel. You know, in that Eucharist course, inevitably, we have to talk about the priesthood. And that always leads to other questions regarding, for example, who can be ordained and who can't be ordained. I don't intend to chase that issue here, but one of the books I always refer the students to is a book that was written by Sister Miriam Therese Winter. I don't know if that name means anything. When I told it to my students, that glazed look came over their eyes, which told me they didn't recognize it at all. But for those of you who are my age, which has to be some of you, and who may have grown up in Philadelphia, you might recall that in the 1960s, there was, and it still is, she's still alive, a medical missionary sister. They have their mother house here in Philadelphia, and her name is Sister Miriam Therese Winter, and she wrote a collection of songs entitled Joy is Like the Rain. We would call them folk music. I'm not ashamed to say, despite the fact that I like Gregorian chant and polyphony and the modern liturgical music, I also liked that folk music. Joy is like the rain, Spirit of God. God gives his people strength. But there was a wonderful little song that Sister Miriam Therese Winter wrote called 10 Lepers. I remember it because we learned it in 6th grade. I didn't remember all of the verses, but I remembered the refrain. 10 unclean and nowhere to go. 10 men cleansed as clean as snow. No one came back to give God thanks except one, and 9 went away. And it got me to thinking about how 9 times out of 10, we forget to thank God for the ordinary miracles and the gifts that God gives us. I have that album that Sister Miriam Therese Winter did on my iPad now. And I went back and listened to the song. In school, unfortunately, we never got to the 4th or the 5th verse. I guess music class was too short. But I went back and I listened to the lyrics. And I just want to share them with you. In the 4th and the 5th verses, she sings, God gives gifts to us every day, favors his people in every way, hope restored and pain relieved. Do we ever give thanks for a gift received? Thank you, Lord, for the summer sun, for sight and song and good deeds done, for faith and family and loving friends, for the day that begins and the night that ends. I don't doubt for 1 minute that we are in action in a world that is broken and brutal and tragic and hurting. But at the same time, if we stop and we look around, we'll also begin to realize, if we haven't already, that God also gives us many gifts each day. And often, they don't make a lot of noise. To go back to Cape May, before I left this summer, I was walking around the town and I stopped in church. I was coming out of the church, Our Lady Star of the Sea, run by the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales, who are also here in Philly. And as I was coming out, I heard all of this hollering and yelling and screaming. And I looked over and I saw that it was 2 parents. They were screaming at their little girl. And I thought to myself, what on God's green earth could this little creature be doing that would warrant this? And so I sat on a bench and I watched. Well, right outside of the church, there's this fountain. People throw coins in the fountain, pennies and nickels and dimes and quarters. And this little girl kept going over to the fountain and scooping them out and bringing them over to her parents. And they would yell at her and tell her to bring them back. I'm not trying to advocate greed or avarice, but it seems to me that the little girl was on to something. As we journey through life, so often that's the way it is. We don't always get the Powerball, but God so often strews pennies and nickels and dimes and quarters along the way as gifts. And perhaps the proper perspective is to bow down and to thank. The great Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain once said that gratitude is the most exquisite form of courtesy. And maybe the question is, every once in a while, do we stop to say thank you to God, to say thank you to Mary who walks with us, to say thank you to each other for being there? I know it sounds funny, but I have this really, really strange idea that when we finally walk through that door that we call death, that one of the first things that God is going to say to us is, thank you. Because I think God is the most exquisitely courteous one of all.